I'm deep in the reads, and I just finished my first book of the year. And yeah, it took me 2 months to read. You see, me and my friend Aaron decided that 2024 would be our year where we would focus primarily on reading the gigantic books that we're always putting off, right? And then maybe a few shorter books in between. But for the most part, we're sticking to books of around 1,000 pages in something that she calls Titanic Tome 2024. And Alaska by James Michener was the first book that I read. To explain the book, I kind of need to explain James Michener. James Michener first started writing novels in his 40s. He came out with Tales of the South Pacific to instant international acclaim, and from there he started developing this formula where he would take a place, he would name the novel after it, and it would just be this huge, sprawling story spanning hundreds or even thousands of years about this place. So you learn a ton while you're getting all of these little adventure stories kind of packed into it. And, you know, you might be thinking, that sounds a little bit niche, but apparently you'd be wrong, because James Michener novels sold like hotcakes, and he came out with them like basically every year, so he was just speed writing this stuff. And it got to the point where people started asking James Michener, hey, could you please write a story about our state or whatever? And that led to a bunch of imitators cropping up who were kind of doing the same thing. So James Michener basically became a cottage industry unto himself. So after reading this giant, ambitious work of historical fiction, what did I think about it? It was decent. Yeah. I will say that this was definitely an interesting reading experience. On the one hand, I can totally see why James Michener was as popular as he was for as long as he was, yet on the other hand, I understand why the literary critics of his time would sort of turn their noses up at him, or why his novels have kind of fallen out of recognition in the past couple decades. He writes his stories with this sort of manly machismo sort of pulpiness that you would expect in like old adventure serials. Everyone talks to each other like they're in a frickin' John Wayne movie, and he kind of smooths over all the hard-nosed non-fiction stuff with a lot of like schmaltziness that makes it sort of very accessible and easy to read, despite how frickin' huge this book is. But even if you don't really jive with that kind of thing, the book just is able to convey this really effective sense of grandeur and scale and adventure and the unknown and all this stuff. I got completely swept away by this sense of wanderlust, and not only that, he also conveys this theme of like how we and the course of human history can be so affected by the landscapes that we're shaped by. The book starts off millions of years in the past, where Michener talks about the forming of the continents and how Alaska was eventually formed, and then you get like woolly mammoths, and he writes the story from a mammoth's perspective for a bit, and then a little later you get the first humans, and they, you know, cross the land bridge during the Ice Age. They become Inuit and Aleutian peoples, and you learn about their culture, you start to empathize with them, and then you jump like thousands of years into the future. And this is where I was wondering, okay, this book is a little bit dated. Is he going to whitewash the colonialism? He does not. He is rightly very unflinching at depicting the sheer brutality of colonial violence in this book. It reads like Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. You get like mass killings right away, people are enslaved, there's a lot of like sexual violence, and it's just this relentless, brutal wave of showing you that Michener has no qualms about talking about the horrific history of his own nation. But Michener never really lingers on the traumatic shit in the way that you might expect. He kind of has this semi-detached writing style that reminds me of like a newspaper article, for example. So you're kind of getting a blow-by-blow, and, you know, because he's obviously covering thousands of years in this book, it makes sense that his writing style is as efficient as it is. But regardless of the style he's using, just the facts that he's reporting to you about the colonialism is completely stomach-churning anyway. And at the same time, he's not just constantly barraging you with depressing, horrible shit. He's weaving between this tone of like, oh my gosh, look at how terribly indigenous peoples are being treated. And then on the other hand, he's overwhelming you with this grand sense of scale and adventure and discovery and like just the ambition of these people. Even though a lot of them are horrible, you're still, you know, swept away by the grandeur of it all. So the first chunk of the book basically follows this like consuming of one Aleutian island after another as the Russians get closer and closer to mainland Alaska. And then all of a sudden they're just like, oh yeah, Russia just sold Alaska to the Americans for like 7 million. You can leave now. And you're just like, wait, what? Like they haven't even seen like most of Alaska by this point. They're just like, oh yeah, there's like trees in there, something. I don't know, let's sell it. From that point on, you kind of shift away from the colonial narrative and it becomes more about harnessing all of these resources that keep getting discovered. So you get this huge section on gold, which is like 200 pages on its own. You get this section on the salmon rush and all of this other stuff going on where it's like, oh shit, we've got a resource, we gotta monopolize this shit. And you see all this unfairness and double dealings and backstabbing to like gain control of these resources in the most like unsustainable ways you can imagine. And then you hit the 1900s all of a sudden and modernity just hits you in the face out of nowhere, and you know, suddenly you've got kids carpooling to school and watching cartoons on TV and riding around in their snowmobiles, and you feel like an old man. You're just like, I remember when you had to climb over a mountain just to give your next door neighbor a how to do. It's just really this weird dash forward in time, and all along you're getting these mini stories, you're meeting new characters with their own problems and their own relationships. While there's obviously a lot to enjoy about Alaska, it's hard to write a novel this long without it being a little bit uneven. And with the chapters in this book being so long that they feel like their own standalone novels, some chapters are much more interesting than others. My favorites were the ones on the gold rush and the ones where it's like the Russians devouring one Aleutian island after the other. Because, you know, the stakes were high, it was really dramatic and epic and all this other stuff. But even in those chapters, I could detect the weaknesses around the character writing and the dialogue and the exposition dumps, but because there's so much going on, it's easy to ignore the flaws. But in the weaker chapters, the flaws sort of take center stage, and what you're left with is a bunch of manly men explaining things to one another. There's also a lot of cheesy romance in this book, and almost every case of romance has a similar formula where it's like an older white man gets with a young indigenous girl of like 15 years old and they get married like instantly, and you know, at first it's okay because it's like it's 1780, people got married very young and very fast, okay fine. But then you get to like the swinging 60s and you still have like this age gap insta-love dynamic going on, and you're just like, dude, you gotta stop trying to write romance. You can't do it. And then, you know, the book is dated in other ways too, but some ways are more understandable than others. Like, James Michener was 80 when he wrote this 40-year-old book, so you expect a little bit of that. But, you know, you understand that his empathy lies with indigenous people throughout this book, so you understand that he's just limited by the language of his time. He's doing his best for the most part. Unfortunately, I should probably mention that this book has aged pretty poorly in a few places, and Michener ends up falling into a few stereotypes despite himself. As far as the characters in this book go, they're fairly interchangeable. There's a mix of historical figures and made-up fictional characters. The fictional characters definitely dominate the stories, and I would say a lot of them are just like everyman, like generic everyman goes out in search of adventure kind of thing, you know. But then there are some characters that really do stand out. For me, it was Missy Peckham and Kendra Scott, who ended up pretty well-rounded by the end. The book also is full of extremely hateable characters. He really knows how to enrage you. There's this one Russian guy who is especially brutal in the Aleutian Islands, and then there's this other character who starts off like a pretty decent guy, but then once he starts working for the salmon company, he starts turning into this massive dick, and you just hate him by the end. And then, you know, there's just an avalanche of characters, hundreds just constantly coming at you, and you'll be like way into the book, and then suddenly you're introduced to like the great-great-grandson of a character that you met like 500 pages ago. And generally the book is pretty good at reminding you of who is who and how they're related, but there were a few times where I had to like go back and remind myself. While Michener is usually pretty good at teasing out the conflict and the drama from the stories he's telling you, he sometimes drops the ball in the weirdest ways where he just doesn't go for it, you know? So, for example, we get introduced to several characters throughout the book who are like upstanding, they're very moral, they'll always do the right thing even if it means taking a risk or getting their hands dirty, and then the protagonists get confronted with somebody who's completely evil and they're doing something appalling, and so we think that there's going to be this big clash and they're going to stand up to the oppressors, but then they'll just end up sitting on their hands and lamenting how bad things are getting, and we're like, we've seen you take care of shit like this, get up off your ass and do something. And you're just like, why are you dropping the ball like this? It's just a really weird thing. Speaking of dropping the ball, I found that Michener kind of lost focus in the last chapter or two. Like, the earlier chapters were very forward-driven and purposeful, but then the last chapter, even though the core story of the final chapter is pretty engaging, Michener keeps bouncing away from it like he's bored, and it's just like, hey, I know you're following this school teacher in Desolation Point, but you want to hear about these Japanese mountaineers? And you're just like, nope, I don't care, just stay focused, please. And he's like, but what about this seismologist in Italy? And you're just like, dude, you have 50 pages left, you have to focus! And then he's just like, there's a guy in Russia who wants Alaska back, and you're like, yeah, well, he didn't get Alaska back, did he? Please fucking focus. Why would you end a book this long, like that, with such a disorganized chapter? It's a really weird way to go out. It's probably a good idea that I remind everyone that while I did have my issues with this book, overall I still liked it. I give it a 6 out of 10, meaning, you know, it was decent, which I realize is not the most satisfying thing to say about a book that I've spent 2 months reading. But I'm still glad that I read it, I'm happy about the time that I spent with it, and, you know, it really showed me just how much storytelling potential there is in setting a novel around a place throughout its history. I am kind of curious, are James Michener novels much different in terms of quality from one to the other? Many of them did follow this locale formula, so is it just a matter of which locale you prefer spending time in, or are some of them like markedly better than others? So if you've read multiple Michener books, first of all, congratulations on making it to 100. Second of all, I'd love to hear from you about what you think about Michener and how his works have held up over the years and all that stuff. And maybe I've convinced some people to give Michener a chance because, yeah, his books are a little bit dated, but they're also pretty interesting to read. So, yeah, I guess that's it for my review. Thank you for watching. I don't know when I'll be back because my next book is also massive, but I will be back. So you have that to look forward to. Until then, see you later.